Elongated stitches form variations in texture within the work and can be cabled or crossed. They can be twisted together. They can even be formed irregularly to form interesting patterns in the work. Sometimes this is a little bit easier seen from the purl side, but the variations are quite endless. Because the carriage can only form a stitch that's so large, a manual process is required to make stitches bigger than that of the carriage. To do this, pull all the needles to hold and then draw them back just so that the live stitches begin to close the latches. Remove the working yarn from the feeder and lay the working yarn across the open needle hooks. Then draw the needles back further to close the latch and trap this manually laid yarn within the hook. Pull a bit of excess yarn from the tension mast. We don't want anything too tightly tensioned on the working yarn end. And pull back the needle butts to draw through a large stitch. In this example, I'm pulling them all the way back to non-working position, forming pretty substantial loops. After you've worked across the entirety of your work, pull the knitting forward so that the needles are back in working position and the large loops are still in the hooks of the needle. Because the working yarn is now opposite the carriage, we need to free pass so that the carriage and the working yarn are again on the same side. So in this example, I've set the carriage to slip to the left, free passed, then I redeposited my yarn in the feeder and knit back across. So here you can see this giant row of stitches formed. I'll demonstrate this again. You can knit any number of rows between these long stitches, certainly up to you and whatever effect you're trying to achieve. It's important to make sure that the working yarn is straight. This will ensure ease of knitting back manually. If one needle is pulled back and it interrupts that straight line, it'll be much harder to knit back from the opposite side of the working yarn. It's going to put some unnecessary tension as it's drawn through all of the previous needles to be knit into this elongated stitch. Again, no tension is applied to the working yarn. We need it to feed quite freely into the needle hooks so that it can form these stitches. Another method of free passing the carriage is to pull all of the needles to hold, set the carriage to hold, and knit across. Quite a few variations that are still hand manipulated that you can work within these large stitches are to form cables. You can make cables that are quite wide in terms of the number of stitches that are crossed because you've got quite a bit of play in this extra length within the stitch. One issue that you're seeing me have here is that because there's not a ton of weight pulling down each long stitch, I'm splitting the yarn a bit when I'm trying to take it off onto the transfer tool. So I probably could have used an extra weight here in the center, but no matter, I was still able to work around it. twisted stitches are quite possible and form an even more open, cleanly twisted look with long stitch versus its regularly tensioned version. Here it's much easier to twist these stitches around because, again, I've got such an elongated loop that there's quite a bit of play, making it much easier to manipulate the tool. In this last iteration, instead of drawing all of the stitches back all the way to hold, I'm gonna vary the length of each stitch manually. You can create some really interesting curved or waved effects by varying the degree in which you knit back, forming both small and long stitches within the same row.